This is Eric with Torq-Masters. We are here today. We're going to do a step-by-step installation video of the TORQ Locker in our Subaru Outback Wilderness. This is for the VA2 type rear differentials. I'll put the plug back in while I'm taking the thing out, then it isn't dripping all over the floor. I like to start with relieving the punch on the axle nut. Your CV axle is going to have a keyway, and then at the factory, anytime the CVs are changed, it gets punched down. So we have to pop that back out or relief it, so that the nut can come off without doing damage to the axle. And don't go too far with it, because you're going to want to be able to punch that back down. And then it'll come off without damaging the threads. Next, we're going to pull the caliper and the bracket assembly off so we can get that out of the way. It possibly could be done with that all in place, but I like to remove it just so we don't end up bending a line or kinking a line. So I take the bracket off the hub, and a 17mm socket to get the top bolt. I'll pull your connection here. Get that out of the way. And one thing to note is the rotor is loose. So it's a two-handed job, or just make sure that you don't knock the rotor off, because if that hits the ground, it's not going to be a good day. So I like to use my little caliper hooks and just hang the caliper up out of the way so that there's no stress on the brake line, and I can pull the rotor off and set it off to the side. This one will have a little tension on it. Okay, so that just needs a little tap. You can see this groove here. That's where that cross bolt, that pinch bolt, rides. So it's under a little bit of spring pressure, so it just needs a little bump to get it out of the way. That one's tight. Okay. Now you're free to move the hub out and gently pull the CV out. I like to get it up on top here. Just rest it in a nice place for a moment. And what I found is the easiest and safest way is a bungee cord, just to hold it up out of the way. So it's free, it's not riding on the hub. So you don't need two hands to pry the CV out. because the bungee cord's helping it. So we've already drained the differential of most of its fluid, so it won't come dumping out on you. So that's it. It's actually pretty easy to get these out, get the shafts out. A lot easier than some of the older models, but now let's pull the differential out. So use a pry bar, gently get it in the yoke so you have some resistance to break the nuts loose. The last two bolts are up here. They're the mounts for the upper studs that are part of the differential case itself, or I should say part of the cover. In our case, we had the skid plate so that these two nuts are already off this lower mount. We're going to leave the bolts in place just to help stabilize it while we take the upper ones out. 17 millimeter. And just note the orientation of this mounting plate. It's basically looks like it's got some weights on it to help with vibration from the factory, but it does have an arrow pointing up. So essentially, the only thing holding this in now are the two bolts here on this lower mount. Go to the bench. Now that we have the differential out of the vehicle, it's on the table here and much easier to work on. I highly suggest you go through your kit, make sure all the parts are in here before you get started. Because we pre-drained the differential while it was still in the vehicle, it makes taking the differential cover off a lot less messy. We've already removed the bottom two bolts because we had the skid plate installed. And now we're going to remove the rest. 14 millimeter socket. Just be gentle with your gasket. You're going to keep that clean and set it off to the side. So on this differential, the backlash for the ring and pinion is set by these side sundials. It's very important that these are removed and replaced in the same position. We're going to show you how to do that. The difference between the 5-bolt and the 1-bolt is essentially how this bearing cap is held in place. And in this model, the VA2 type, there is only 1 bolt. The side bearing retainers are removed with either a special tool, or in this case, we're going to use the simple way with a hammer and a punch. So what we want to do is we want to mark the cap itself, and we also want to mark the housing so that this is the spot that it's going to stop. And we're also going to count the revolutions as we take it out. So what I like to do is mark the top. It's just simple and always easy to remember. And then be sure to mark the case and make it big, make it easy to see. That way it doesn't get wiped off. 14 millimeter on this retainer key as well. So that's 3 revolutions, 4, and I also like to mark the point that it comes out. That's 5, or I should say where it's going to start. 6, 7, And I'll mark that with a different shape. So I did that with a V, so I know that that's my start point. And good time to inspect your O-ring. This basically seals it to the housing. And also mark this as our passenger side because it has the drain plug. So I'm going to put a P. The other side can be removed in the same way. So now that we've pulled the other side bearing retainer out, the carrier can be removed from the differential. And now we can work on installing the locker. Next step is to remove the ring gear bolts, and best practice is to mark the ring gear in its original location on the carrier so that it can be reinstalled in the same position. $17mm. So next, we've got to punch the roll pin out that holds the cross pin inside the carrier. So make sure your punch is appropriately sized. You want the largest you can in the hole so that it makes a good contact. Now we can push the cross pin out. Take the spider gears out. And that's easiest done just by rolling them, and then the rest of them will fall out once the first one comes out. And pay attention to the thrust washers that are in this differential. I'm going to make sure that they come out with the axle gears. We've got both of them on the spider gear. With this differential, there are no cone washers on the spiders. But you would want to look for those with other differentials. Make sure they're out. Now we're ready to install the TORQ Locker into the carrier. And this is the kit, and it includes the 4 parts of the locker and the 2 springs. You've got the 2 cam gears and the 2 axle gears, and note that the axle gears come with the circlips for the CV axles pre-installed. You're also going to reuse the 2 thrust washers that you took out of your differential, and you're going to reuse your roll pin and your cross pin from the stock differential. So let's install the TORQ Locker. You're going to take your axle gear, make sure you put 1 thrust washer on. You've already done a thorough wipe down of the inside just to make sure there's no contaminants. And insert the axle gear with thrust washer on one side. And take the cam gear. Take your second axle gear with a thrust washer. You can then slide that in on the top side. And you'll notice the orientation of the cam gears. There's a boss and a pocket. You're going to make sure that you have them in the right orientation, and they'll slide right in. So now you can rotate the whole assembly. And I like to use the cross pin to help hold it in place. So you'll gently lift up. Make sure you align the cross pin and the roll pin hole. You can slide it through. And that helps with installing the springs, makes it a little easier. See if we can rotate that around. So I know a lot of people struggle with the springs. They're a lot of fun. This is my little tip that makes them a little easier so they don't go flying. I like to install the spring down and towards me, and I usually keep a thumb or a finger on the spring, and I use a flat bladed screwdriver about the same size as the recess in the locker, and they pop right in every time. Just make sure they're fully seated down in the recess in the locker. Flip the whole assembly over and do the same thing. And the key to that maneuver is the thumb or the finger in place. So if you do slip, the spring doesn't go flying. So now we're going to insert the roll pin into the cross pin. And you just want to make sure that you're pre-aligned before you go hammering that in there. So we'll do a quick check. Insert it by hand. Give it a visual inspection, just make sure it's all the way in. And what you're looking for is to make sure that it's about equal on both sides of the cross pin. So the one final step before we finish up this installation is to measure the center gap. That's the dimension between the two cam gears. And it's as simple as zeroing your dial caliper, getting it in there nice and square, and right there we're at 160 thousandths, and that's the perfect dimension for this locker assembly. The center gap acceptable range is from 145 thousandths to 170 thousandths. If you're not within those specs, please give us a call or contact us via email. So now we're going to prep the ring gear for reinstallation, and you want to remove all the existing oil from both the bolts and the holes. So we're going to do that with some brake cleaner and blow it out with compressed air. Make sure you get it off the bolts as well. Give them a good wipe. We're going to be reinstalling these with red thread locker. 271 and 272 is the part number preferred for applications that involve immersion in gear oil. And pay attention to not wipe away your paint mark. Apply a drop or two to each bolt. And then reinstall the ring gear, aligning your alignment marks. You're going to start all your ring gear bolts by hand. You never want to draw the ring gear onto the carrier with the bolts if it needs some help. You always want to do that by hand. Once you've aligned your marks and you've confirmed the ring gear is fully seated, you can tighten the rest of the bolts and then begin to tighten them in an alternating pattern so it draws the ring gear on evenly. Now we can put the carrier in a vise so that we can torque the ring gear bolts to the proper spec. Now it's time to start reassembling the differential. And after you've gone through and done a wipe down of your surfaces, make sure everything's clean, you can start reinserting your parts. You're going to start with your carrier. And your bearing caps. Make sure you apply a little bit of oil to the O-ring to help it slide in smooth. We've also applied some anti-seize compound to the threads to help prevent galvanic action and corrosion, and so we could always reassemble or disassemble this at a later date. I'm going to align my marks where I stopped, and we're going to rotate the same number of turns that we measured on the way out. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That was 6. And that should be in the same position. We'll just repeat it on the other side. So that's 7 turns on each one. Now that we've reinstalled the bearing retainers in their original position, that's going to reset the backlash back to the way it was when it was stock. We've aligned our marks and turned them in the number of turns that we recorded when we took them out. So now we can install the locking tabs, and these are only going to go in one direction, so you might have to flip it over just to align them properly. But that's going to keep the bearing cap in its place. Now we're ready to install the diff cover. You always want to make sure your gasket is clean. You don't want any dirt or debris in between the mating surface of the gasket and the diff cover and the housing. We're going to add a little dab of Loctite to each bolt. Start all your diff cover bolts by hand so you don't risk pinching the gasket. And in our situation, we're going to leave the bottom 2 out because those are reinstalled when we reinstall our aluminum skid plate. This model doesn't have a fill plug in the cover. It has the fill plug on the side. So now we're ready to reinstall the differential assembly back in the car and take it for a test drive.